Greetings, everyone. My name is Sarah Barnes, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I'd like to welcome you to What's Your Data Plan? Using Analytics to Drive Fundraising Success. Before we begin today's interesting discussion, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to Campbell & Company webinars. As you'll see on the screen, there are just a few quick instructions. First, close any programs, then go to webinars that are running on your computer. Call in using a telephone instead of your computer speakers. Move away your cell phone from your computer. And finally, if you experience any visual issues, send a chat to us or contact GoTo at 1-800-263-6317. And finally, today's webinar will last 15 minutes, and you will earn 1 continuing education credit for your participation. Good for certification with CFRE International. About an hour after the webinar, you will receive an email from GoToWebinars that includes a web address to download your certificate, the PDF of the presentation, as well as information on how to receive complimentary registration for our next webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send a chat to Campbell & Company. And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce Carrie Dahlquist and Jeff Wilklow. Carrie Dahlquist is the Director of Strategic Information Services at Campbell & Company. She helps organizations understand how complex information can impact the big picture and inform the decision-making process. She works with institutions to develop a roadmap that is manageable and measurable. Carrie holds a Master of Business Administration from the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business with concentration in economics and strategy. Jeff Wilklow is a Vice President at Campbell & Company and has worked with more than 100 institutions. Jeff helps organizations see themselves from a donor's perspective. Jeff shares his enthusiasm for relationship building with each institution, and his track record of developing successful long-term partnerships between organizations and their donor groups demonstrates just how effective his enthusiasm is. Prior to his position with Campbell & Company, Jeff was the Vice President of Development for the Points of Light Foundation, where he helped conceive and develop a $100 million campaign for program support. He's an active member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, chapter of Greater Washington, D.C. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Carrie. Carrie?
Thanks, Sarah. And I just want to thank my colleague Jeff for being with me here today. We've both had a lot of experience helping clients work through the complex information that's out there, and we're happy to share our experiences with you this afternoon. Just want to acknowledge that many of you were kind enough to complete a survey for us, an online survey prior to the webinar, and we wanted to share some of the information that we received from you and share some of our insights. It was really good information, and just wanted to focus on a couple of points about you, the audience, that help provide some context for us as we conceived and constructed today's presentation. So wanted to just share a little bit of information about how our audience today sees data as it relates to their role within their organization. Interestingly, Jeff and I discussed this, more of you use the data rather than actually work with producing the data on a regular basis. So that will really come into play later as we talk about the importance of implementation and its impact on relationship management. So we thought that was particularly interesting. We also thought it was interesting that I don't think there were very, very few people who thought it wasn't important, that data didn't play an important role in some way, shape, or form in driving fundraising efforts. So over 90% said that data was at least somewhat important in terms of its impact on fundraising efforts within our advancement operations. But interestingly, many of you scored yourselves relatively low in terms of how effective you're using that information. So the chart on the right-hand side of our screen shows that all but prospect research and reporting are being used less than somewhat effectively on average across your organization. So I think we, as a collective entity, agree that information is becoming more and more important in our daily efforts and to help drive fundraising success. But there's more and more information out there, and I think we're struggling more and more with how to implement that information effectively, how to make sure that we're connecting all the dots across the many forms of information that are out there, and how we make sure that you have sort of a seamless data plan as we're going to be discussing today. So want to just explore for a moment today's goals, and we've got a lot. We understand that this is an ambitious agenda, and we've got a lot to do. We want to reiterate that a lot of this information will be available to you after the webinar today, and that Jeff and I are available if there are any follow-up questions. So I think big picture, what we want to get done today is, first and foremost, we want to acknowledge all of the, well, not all of, we want to acknowledge the many different kinds of information that's out there. This will not be a complete list by any stretch, but we wanted to just sort of give broad strokes. What kind of information do you have access to? And we wanted to talk about, you know, how you as an organization can think about interpreting results from all that those different kinds of information. And I think as we're gonna then shift focus to talking, I think about, and Jeff's insights will be particularly important here, to talk about how do we really use this on the ground? How can we take all this information, interpret the results, and then how can you, the organization, really use this information? In particular, you know, we want to talk about big picture programs, but also how can we use this information to build individual prospect pipelines and individual strategies to help further our engagement with individual prospects and donors. And then finally, we want to very clearly detail the steps for implementing your own data plan. And we're going to hopefully have time to do that at the end and take you through what we have found to be the very important steps for making sure that you approach that in a logical way and bring all the key stakeholders along with that process. So now I want to turn it over to Jeff, and he's going to walk us through the philanthropic landscape.
Thanks, Carrie. So let's take a look at the philanthropic landscape that you're working in. Many of you have seen the Giving USA information that comes out every year, and we know that the lion's share of the money is coming from individuals. In addition to donations from individuals, we have a significant number of the foundations are actually family foundations, so it's individuals who are driving the gift giving there, and certainly bequests and the gifts that are left to organizations through people's wills are also driven by individuals. So in fact, it's a pretty large piece of this pie, over 88%, that is contributed by individuals. And yet when we think about gathering information on our donors and doing research on our donors, the information on foundations and corporations is readily available through the 990s they filed and the tax returns and the information in Foundation Directory and Corporate Directory. But the information on individuals is a little bit harder for us to get to. The fact is that most of those individual donors, information on those individual donors, you already have access to. It's in your databases. So we want to be able to key in on that group and what we know about them. Another thing about the philanthropic landscape is what's happened with total giving over the period of the last 40 years. When you look at this chart, you see that it's generally been going up pretty regularly. We've had a couple of dips here and there because of recessions, but nothing to the extent that we saw in 2007 and 2008. The market the fundraising went down considerably as the market dropped considerably, and it's been coming back up the last 3 years, but it hasn't come even close yet to the highs of 2007. So we're still we're finding that it's harder to find the money out there. There's less money to be raised, less is being donated, and that has a significant impact on your ability to raise it. That has a lot to do with why it's been tougher. So some trends that are emerging because of these realities. One is that your institution, the nonprofits themselves, have become much more reliant on philanthropy because as the recession took away reserves, it took a hit on endowments. It often increased the demand for nonprofit services, and yet there wasn't any place to get the money from. State governments, local governments were having a hard time with keeping to their level of funding. So everybody's been looking more and more toward philanthropy in helping to fill the budget gaps at nonprofits. And yet we know that corporate dollars have been tighter. Corporations have been more and more tying their giving to their strategic business interests, which is as they should be doing, but it makes it harder to get to sell tables for your events and things like that. The foundation funding has been flat for a number of years. It's starting to move up a little bit, but for a long time they were closing their doors on new grantees, so it was very difficult to increase funding from the foundation world. It was hard enough just to hang on to what we had. And yet individual giving continues to go up and continues to be the best source of philanthropic dollars. So it's all the more important that we really focus in this area now. Meanwhile, the other trend that we're seeing is that at the nonprofit in your organizations, the financial projections for the organization are increasingly being informed by what's in the prospect pipeline. We're needing to get a lot smarter and a lot more sophisticated about being able to project where the money is and how much we're going to be able to bring in year 1 and year 2, because that's what budgets are being determined on. So your ability to do this smarter has become really incumbent. So what does that mean for you? It means there's a lot more work to do. There's only so many hours in the day, so the only way to get this done is to work smarter. And the data that is available to you can really drive a lot of the work that you're doing and drive a lot of the decisions that you're making and a lot of your operations. And at the end of the day, you need to be strategic about this, and the best way to do that and to stay focused, there's a lot to look at here, is to put together a solid data plan, and we'll tell you what's in that, and we'll tell you how to do that. Carrie?
Great, thank you. So, as I mentioned earlier, we know that we're all on information overload at this point. There's so much, we all have so much access to information. It's coming from so many different directions, but one of the goals of today's presentation is really to help you digest and discern what kind of information is available and what you as an individual organization needs, can use, what's actionable, and what's affordable. Because obviously, you know, each one of the pieces of information that we're going to talk about has its own sort of scope, scale, and cost associated with it. So we're going to dive into a series of different kinds of information that's available to the nonprofit world at the moment. The first one that we want to cover is data appends, and we want to acknowledge that, you know, I think historically we associate data appends with the national change of address updates, and more, thankfully, more and more organizations are incorporating those NCOA updates into their ongoing operations. Either they're doing it in-house or they're doing it through a vendor. I do think, and Jeff, feel free to comment, I do think that there's still a gap for those who are receiving these updates through a vendor and are feeling confident that their mail is reaching the right place. They're not always incorporating the updates actually into their own physical databases, so I think we still have a bit of a gap there. But on the whole, I think organizations are adopting this information, and that there's an ongoing focus on making sure that at least we have home address information up to date. But there are a lot of other kinds of information that's available out there that comes under the heading of these data appends. And I really like to think about them in two sort of broad categories. The first is, how can we contact people, the method in which we are able to contact people. So, you know, we talked a moment ago about the address updates through NCOA, but for some percentage of your constituency, you may have those who are what we call long lost. In other words, you can't access them any longer through NCOA. Typically, that's 4 or more years. Their address has been lost, essentially. So there are a number of services out there that will go further back, as far back as 30 years, to try to find and reconnect you with those people who have long lost addresses. And I don't think, we would not necessarily recommend that you do this across the whole database, but you may have a particular constituency for a particular reason that you need to try to get in touch with, and these types of appends can be really helpful for that. Also, as we talk about the ways in which you communicate with people, obviously email is becoming, you know, more and more affordable, accessible. More and more shops are being able to manage this in-house, and we really see this as, you know, I won't even say the wave of the future. It's here, and we're now, the nonprofit industry using it more and more effectively, I think, in particular, to connect with its younger audience. And we're using this not only in terms of direct response and communication, engagement communications, but also as a means for eliciting opinions through, opinion research and surveys. We're finding that to be able to contact people through email is really, really valuable. And there are services out there that can find you these email appends, as well as phone. Much like email, it's great to have multiple methods for staying in touch with your constituents, so that you have a variety of options for contacting them. And phone, whether it's through telephone or wanting to do thank you calls or wanting to connect volunteers with prospects, it's great to be able to use the phone information. The second category of data appends, when I think about these broadly, is information that will allow you to think about how you want it, the message that you want to communicate with people. So whether it's, age, marital status, or deceased flags, these give you some insights into people's lives and can help you craft the tone of a communication, or can give you, insights into what types of information you want to be sending them. I think, Jeff and I have talked a lot about, I think, in particular, planned giving programs and how these appends can be really, really useful as more and more of our clients begin to focus on really adapting and formalizing their planned giving programs. These types of appends can be particularly helpful. Jeff, is there anything you want to add about data appends before we move forward?
Sure. I just think about how much of our daily communication in the workplace is done by email, for example, and yet how much of our fundraising still seems to be address-based. And it's any time that we have a donor's address, but we don't have their phone number or their email, we're just much more limited in the way that we're able to communicate with them. So just by running that database, just by adding the email and the phone appends to your database, gives you so much richer information and such more opportunities to contact somebody. That alone is worth it. And then there's so much that you can do when you have a sense of the age of your donors, not just for planned giving, but just for having a better understanding of where they are in their own circumstances, so you can really be more targeted towards them. So it's all about information, so you can be smarter in your interactions, and this is an easy way to do it.
Great. And I should also mention the importance of that these data appends are relatively inexpensive. I mean, you can get a lot of return on your investment in terms of being able to communicate effectively and engage by just making sure that you've got clean information. And as we move on to the next slide, we're going to talk about electronic screening, and I think this is an important transition, because we were just talking about the importance, for example, of home addresses, which become really, really important if you want to undertake an electronic screening, because those are the fundamental building blocks of screening, is being able to go out and identify people based on their home addresses. So really just underscores the importance of having clean data. So electronic screening, many in our industry are familiar with this. I think we've been using this for a very, very long time as a resource that hasn't changed dramatically in terms of what it is we're analyzing. And so there are a lot of vendors out there who do electronic screening, and no matter who you go with, the end goal generally is to go out into the public universe and find information on wealth, hard assets, careers, and philanthropic connections. And that can mean slightly different things depending on what vendor you're ultimately going with, but generally speaking, we're looking for information that's publicly available, and we're hoping that it will inform estimates on their major giving capacity. You can use electronic screening for lots of different things. And when we dive into client engagement, in particular, as you think through about, who are your top volunteers or your board members, being able to identify people by their philanthropic connections and knowing a bit of information about their careers can be really, really insightful and help you kind of connect dots between those people that are close to your organization and those people that you're trying ultimately to engage. But I think First and foremost, you want to be able to prioritize people based on an estimate of their capacity, and that's what screening allows you to do. Typically, you will receive a major giving capacity or an estimated giving capacity. Again, it varies based on the vendor that you work with, but this is typically about 5% of the total total assets that have been identified through that public screening, and it often represents a 5-year period. So it essentially represents a major gift. And the importance of it is that it represents all philanthropic giving. So this is not necessarily the amount that somebody's going to give to your organization, but it's the amount that they could be philanthropically capable of giving over a 5-year period. And then the goal, obviously, is to capture as much of that as you possibly can as an organization. So there are a lot of advantages to screening. There are in particular some advantages as you think about constructing gift tables or campaign tables, whether those tables are campaign or annual. We have found these capacities to be really, really helpful as we think through the potential of an entire prospect pool. And obviously that will ultimately be discounted, but just having a great starting place to be able to sort of roll up and aggregate how much potential your prospect pool has and how does that relate to what you need over a given year or a given campaign period is really, really useful. And then we talk about identifying the gaps. Once you have an annual table or a campaign table and you've rolled up that capacity and you can see, what is it that you need to be able to meet those annual goals or those campaign goals, what does it look like you have at the moment in terms of your philanthropic potential, and where are there gaps? And then being able to identify those gaps, and as we'll talk later, really think through strategies for moving people up the pyramid or moving people through the pipeline. That's going to really focus on relationship management, and we're going to dive into that later. I just want to reiterate before we move on, though, the importance of manual confirmation. So it's actually two things when it comes to screening. First, as I mentioned, this is not necessarily the amount that people will give to your organization. It's also not the full value of all of their assets. This is just information that's publicly available, which, I think in particular, Jeff and I are seeing this more and more in some of our engagements. The wealthier you are, the better you are at hiding that wealth. And so I've heard quotes recently that say, the amount that's captured in a screening may only be 40% of what's really there. So we're really using this as a directional indicator, but it's still an important directional indicator to be able to help you prioritize that prospect list, have some sense of who's at the top and who you may want to be paying closer attention to, in particular, outside of the group that you already know. So I'm certain you already have trustees, board members, high-level volunteers that you already know a lot of information about. And for those people, screening is not going to be particularly helpful. You probably already know more information about their assets and their inclination and the capacity than screening would give you insights on. But it's really helpful for that next group of people. So we're going to help you prioritize those that you don't know as much information about. And screening is a really great way to be able to sort and then begin to vet that list. But you can't do that without manually confirming some of the information. So whether it's a dedicated position or outsourcing or part-time or really being absorbed by another function in your organization, it's really important to know that in order to use this information most effectively, somebody is going to need to be responsible for reviewing it and confirming it. Jeff, anything you want to say about screening?
No, that's good, Kara. I think you've covered it well.
Great. We're going to move on to talk about scoring. So RFM scoring, recency, frequency, and monetary scoring is really, this is a simple marketing technique. It's been used for a really long time, and I think it's really, really useful as a starting point. When we were talking a moment ago about directional indicators for screening, I think RFM scoring is a really simple way to think about prioritizing your prospect pool essentially based on their inclination. So we're looking at how recently people have made gifts, how often they're making gifts, and how much they're giving. And we're using that to essentially score your entire database to help you think through this is one view of who are your best donors, and it's much more. We spend a lot of time talking about reviewing people and their capacity to make gifts and their inclination to make gifts. So when we talked about screening a moment ago, we said you're not going to have insights into how likely somebody is to make a particular gift to your organization. You're just going to have a sense of what their overall capacity is. If you couple screening with something like an RFM score, which is going to give you a deeper insight into essentially their inclination. So you can use these two things in combination to get a sense of who are those people that look like they have the most capacity and who is behaving like they have higher inclination toward your organization. And the beauty of RFM is that almost anybody can do it. You can do it in an Excel spreadsheet, and it's, to say inexpensive is probably not underscoring enough. You can do this in Excel in a very short amount of time. And we're actually going to have a worksheet up on the website following this presentation to walk you through RFM scoring. Now, it's important to note that, that this is not as strategic. It's a really great starting point, and it's a really great solution for people that don't have the resources to invest in other kinds of information. But as we're gonna move on in just a moment to predictive modeling, and we're gonna make the point that you can be much more insightful than RFM scoring, but in a pinch, this is a really great starting point. Jeff, anything you want to add?
Yeah, the other thing about RFM is that it comes from the marketing world, and so a lot of times your board members will be familiar with it if you have board members who are in business, and it's one of those things they like to see that you have a handle on who your best donors are, just the way they do with their best business prospects and clients.
Yeah, that's a great point. The other thing before we move on to modeling, the other thing to say about RFM is that it's very transparent, so you can very quickly sort of deconstruct where somebody's score came from. And now as we transition to predictive modeling, I can compare that to a much more complex approach to predictive modeling, which is really designed to answer a question and can and is it's a bit more of a black box to the end user. So you were talking a moment ago about those board members and how they like to see these types of scores. The predictive modeling, I think, are scores that we're starting to see have become more insightful, and I think the industry as a whole is getting better at doing these. I think in particular over the last few years, we're seeing more vendors get better at doing this. And we're frankly seeing, in particular in larger shops, we're seeing more and more development operations bring this function in-house so they can answer a series of questions. I think when you're doing this through a vendor, while you can ask almost any question you want, you do that at a cost. And so typically when we use these services through a vendor, we're most often focused on what is somebody's major gift likelihood, what is somebody's planned gift likelihood, what is their annual giving likelihood, what is a target gift range or a suggested ask amount. So very specific questions and typically geared at how likely is somebody to make a gift and what is the size of that gift. As you bring these functions in-house, you've got a lot more flexibility to ask all kinds of different questions, like, what are the best ways to communicate with different segments of people, or let's work on conversion from non-donors to donors. You can certainly do that through vendors as well, but as I mentioned, all of those will be additional costs. But I think the idea, whether you're doing it in-house or through a vendor, the idea of predictive modeling and its ability to have real impact on your program and real insights into your prospect pool is becoming more and more evident as we get comfortable with the kind of information that you're receiving. I think, if we take a step back and again talk about the transparency of RFM scoring, I think the disadvantage of predictive modeling is that it is a bit of a black box. And that's not to say that you can't have it explained, but it's not quite as clear-cut as an RFM score. And so there will likely be more definition needed, more analysis and interpretation needed to be able to communicate this type of information effectively to an audience, in particular leadership and the board. But at the end of the day, predictive modeling has gotten really, really good at helping us focus on the quote-unquote right people, whoever those right people are, whatever the question is that you're hoping to answer. And for me in particular, I found this to be really, really helpful as I think through upgrade strategies, segmentation strategies, communication strategies, just knowing a little bit about what it looks like somebody is capable of giving. And as we think through that target gift range or that suggested ask amount, that's a bit of a combination between capacity and inclination, which I think, again, is one of the values of predictive modeling, is that it can give you some insight into, who are your best donors now, what are the characteristics that make them your best donors, and who else in your prospect pool looks like those people, and then what does it look like they're capable of giving based on those characteristics. So we've been able to really use these models in a lot of different ways to ask a lot of different questions, and more importantly, as we focus on implementation, to really be thoughtful about segmentation strategies and really being thoughtful about where somebody has been giving historically and what it looks like they may have potential to give.
Carrie, I do have a question from the audience. Isn't it becoming more common for vendors to combine predictive modeling, screening, and RFM?
So yes, I think one good question. I think the idea of combining these is really important. I would say that I don't see RFM necessarily combined. Well, yes, yeah, depending on the vendor that you're using, there will be a variety of combinations. But I think the big picture is that in conjunction, you want to get to some sense of capacity and some sense of inclination, and any combination of these will give you greater insight into those two factors than any one in a silo. And so I think more and more we're seeing vendors couple some of them together, and it depends on the vendor that you're using. The vendor that you're using will ultimately probably help inform what combination you get, but I think the idea of using these in concert is really, really helpful. And Jeff and I have sort of seen that on the ground. Jeff, anything you want to add?
I think that's great. Thanks.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on to talk about prospect research. And so up until now, we've really just been focused on the data itself and what kind of information is out there. And before we turn to implementation, analysis and implementation, we wanted to spend a moment to focus on the function of prospect research, because this is really where I think the data kind of meets implementation, and the importance of thoughtful review and having somebody vet the information, think about strategy becomes really, really important. So prospect research, some shops have a whole team of prospect researchers, some have one. In other shops, this may be something that one person does for a portion of their time, or it can even be outsourced. So there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to prospect research, but prospect research as a function is really, really important. As we talk about here, this is where the art and the science come together and really allows you greater insight into your top prospects. So prospect researcher really, uses a variety of tools that we've talked about already, as well as a whole slew of online tools to evaluate information that's out there, that's available. This person or this function is really leveraging the information that you've received from vendors or that they can capture through their own research to make strategic recommendations about who these people are, how it looks like they might be best engaged, how can that help inform an engagement strategy, or what information can they provide a frontline officer to help inform a qualification visit or cultivation. And I think in particular we're seeing more and more the importance of proactive prospect research. So that was really more focused on reactive prospect research, right? I'm going to meet with a prospect, and what can you tell me about that prospect? Which is critical, it's a really important function of prospect research. But I also think, we talked a little bit about the gaps earlier, and identifying, being able to identify where there are gaps between the potential of your prospect pool and where you need to be. And I think, proactive prospect research, where someone's job is to go out and find additional prospects to help fill those gaps, is really, really important, and it's becoming recognized as a really critical function in this area. And then just want to underscore that relationship management works best when the frontline, when relationship managers or frontline officers see themselves as partners with this prospect research function. And I think that, we've seen that that's when things work in concert and when we can be most effective and efficient with our time. Jeff, anything you want?
That's a really important point, Carrie, and we often will come in and help an organization with a development assessment and looking at their internal processes. And I often hear from prospect research staff that they don't feel their work is really being well utilized. They may be sitting there cranking out research profiles on a regular basis. They're not sure how much they're being used, and there is maybe a tendency to get somebody in-house and then to have them start to develop all kinds of information for you, but you really need to be thoughtful about what you need and how you're going to use it and putting that information to work, even to the point that I would caution you about hiring a full-time prospect researcher if you don't necessarily need that quantity of information. There's a lot that you can do through electronic sources and contracting it out before you set somebody behind a desk and have them working on that full-time. So you need to be thoughtful about how you're going to use the information.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess while we're on that subject, I'd like to emphasize a point that you make, which is I think in particular we hear that full profiles or quite lengthy profiles are being created for visits very, very early in the relationship. And I think your point about using this function effectively is really important there, and we should really be thoughtful about what kind of information is needed given what stage of the philanthropic life cycle we're in.
Right.
So we're going to move on and just quickly summarize. And I should mention that we are going to have a list of resources, prospect research resources, both fee-based and free, on our website at the conclusion of this webinar as well. So feel free to take a look and see what makes sense given your needs and your budget. Just wanted to summarize here as we talk about needs and resources what we've already talked about. We've got data appends, screening, RFN scores, predictive modeling, and prospect research. And this is not something we're going to spend more than just a moment on, but wanted to let you know that it's here. And as you begin to think through your data plan and the individual pieces that are going to make sense for your organization based on your needs and your budget and your time and resources, that this might be a good place to come back to think through the advantages and disadvantages of each of these. So now we're going to move on to talk about implementation and analysis and how important that is. Jeff?
Yeah, so really there's several major functions that analysis serves in your job as managing the flow of information and managing the work in a development office. And part of it is reviewing what you've done in the past, how have things gone in the past and what have you learned from that, using that information to help you plan for the future, and then using it on a daily basis and a monthly, weekly basis to track and evaluate how you're doing. So in reviewing the past, the tools that are available to you are reporting information from how things have been done, looking at that information over a period of time longitudinally so that you can do trend analysis. Are things going up or are they going down in various areas? You can look at specific segments and how are you doing with donor retention, for example, how are you doing with geographic distribution, those kind of things. So it's all very, very helpful information to look at as you plan for the future and start to make your projections about where you think you could improve and the kind of money you could bring in if you were able to expand the pipeline by by taking a look at these trends and seeing how you can project them out into the future. And then in terms of tracking and evaluating, being able to establish your scorecard of how things are going and being able to establish specific metrics that are important to you. We all know everybody measures dollars, and we sometimes get tied up in knots over the dollars because if they don't come in, then people don't feel like they got any credit for the work they did. There are a lot of reasons that the donations actually come in, but we want to track visits, and we want to track new discovery calls, and we want to track did we move our donors from one stage of relationship management to the next? How many people did we turn into donors who were prospects? How many donors did we upgrade? You know, to what percentage were you able to upgrade? And there are all kinds of metrics, and you need to establish internally which ones are important to you, but do it by thinking about what actually leads to the dollar, so that you can track the process all along the way. And that makes for a much more planned and managed process that you can really see where you are and where you're going, and it makes it a lot better for you to project into the future once you start getting that kind of information. So we want to take a look at an organization. We were called, I'll talk about a client who we were working with, a case study. We were called into an organization and asked to take a look at their work to help them think about how they could significantly increase their major gift fundraising. Their challenge was they had a lot of donors. They had a handful of very large donors at the top of their donor pyramid, and they had a very large base of small donors at the bottom of the pyramid, and very little going on in the middle of what we would consider the traditional major gift space of $5,000, $10,000, $25,000 donors. So it really wasn't a pyramid at all. It was more like an hourglass. So their challenge was they needed to feed this pipeline of new major gift prospects. They didn't even know where to go to get the major gift prospects, and yet they had a very large donor base, as I mentioned, of small donors. So they certainly had the seeds of a pipeline there, but it was questionable data. It was data that had come from a variety of sources over a long period of time. The organization had gone through a lot of organizational change, so even though it was a very old organization, in many ways it was more like a startup, because it only in the last 10 years really gotten serious about tracking this kind of information. And meanwhile, they had staff and volunteers who were ready to go out and start working on prospecting and working with major gift prospects, but they needed help to focus. There's a national program. They had local affiliates in cities all around the country, and they needed to help figure out where they could focus their time and attention. In addition, it's a very data-driven board, a board of volunteers who respect data and were very interested, as was the CEO. So these were people who needed the numbers, needed to see what was available. So a couple other things just by way of context. I mentioned it was an old organization. They had people who had a lot of loyalty to the organization. They'd been around for years. It was a youth organization, but they had donors who were, well into their 70s and 80s who remembered their experience as youth being involved in the organization. So there was a lot of emotional loyalty there, and yet they didn't have very good data at all about people who had been in the program that many years ago. And furthermore, the social media was becoming very important, because their donors, their alumni, were finding each other online through Facebook and through other social media channels. They were reconnecting with each other online, and so the organization really needed to be able to tap into all that. So we first cleaned up the data. The data appends became very important here, because the emails and the phone numbers were very important, but so was the information about the age of the donors, so that we could kind of track where they might be in terms of their own relationship to the organization. And then did the predictive modeling against this very large donor base, and were able to find a really large number of very qualified prospects. So the model really helped narrow that down, and then we narrowed it down geographically, so that people in the field could start to identify ways that they could get people more involved. So we saw that there was lots of opportunity, lots of potential for dollars, and lots of opportunity to get people involved, which got the board energized and got them feeling better about investing more in development, and also taking their time to help open up some of these doors. So we established a relationship management system where everybody had a portfolio. All the key staff had portfolios of prospects and donors, And the volunteers, the board members, had portfolios of donors or prospects who were in their area and were teamed with staff either from the national office or from the field to help contact these folks and start making calls and making visits and getting to know these folks better. They also use research to be able to get a little bit better information on these folks and where they were in their lives, and give them better ideas of how to connect, how to make a warm call and how to make a connection with them. And they also helped them segment the prospects that weren't in the portfolios so that they could start cultivating them and inviting them to various things and trying to engage them, essentially allowing them to self-select. They couldn't make individual calls to everybody, so they took the bulk of the names who they didn't have in portfolios and just started segmenting the invitations to them based on who they were and where they were to see if they could start getting some reaction, some feedback. And that is a work in progress, but they have all developed pretty robust portfolios, and the staff and the volunteers have both reported they're having much more productive meetings with folks. They are raising money. They're getting quite a bit of enthusiasm with the people that they're talking to. They're finding that there are a lot of people who are just wondering, why it's been so long since they've heard from anybody, and they're delighted to reconnect with the organization. So the people were out there, the money was out there, the information was in their database. We just had to help them find it and help them get organized around it to be able to go after it. So that was very helpful. And Carrie, you were involved with that. Anything I missed in terms of how they utilized their data and the analytics process?
No, I mean, I think for me what was particularly interesting about this client is that that they were able to make inroads, I think, in a lot of different ways, and that they had board members who are particularly interested in data, and I don't know that the organization had been used to thinking about their prospects in terms of their potential or in terms of sort of managing those relationships and upgrading them in that way prior to this kind of data plan. So once we were able to help make that connection, they were able to start talking about dollars in a way I think that their board members had been ready to talk about for a while. So I thought that was particularly interesting.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point. So let me just talk about what it takes to make this happen in your organization. Sometimes we were just talking about an organization where people were very data driven, and it was actually almost brought about at the top levels of the organization, this interest in getting a better handle on their data. But often you really need to help sell that up the line. You really need to be able to explain to the CEO and get buy-in from the CEO and the Vice President of Development and everybody in the organization about how important this is going to be and why you're going to do it. And I have to say that I hope in walking through this process we're able to help you make that argument yourself, because I've found that a lot of times a lot of administrators really don't understand what these tools are or what they do. And I've had CEOs say to me afterwards, after we went through a presentation of what was in their database and showed them the kind of money that was in there, that they really had no idea what we were talking about until we sat down with that information and started talking to them. So they had committed to doing it without really understanding what it was or how it was going to work. So don't take for granted that people know what you're talking about when you start throwing around concepts like predictive modeling and even electronic screening and what's going to come out of it. That's often a lot of organizations we work with, we're really talking about a culture shift for the organization in terms of putting data central to your decision making. So including everybody, including senior management and the volunteers in the process, is very important.
And can I just add to that? When you're talking about the culture shift, I think that it can be a bit of a delicate balance because as you mentioned, sometimes this takes a bit of education and educating the key stakeholders, whether that's administrative or board leadership. But sometimes I feel like once they get there, they want to go from 0 to 60. And I think so it's partially explaining the tools and the data plan, and then partially reminding them that this is a process, that there may be culture shift needed, that that this is a prioritization, that it's going to take the right resources, and that ultimately, even once you have a prioritized prospect list and you're able to, manage a small subset of that list, it's going to be a while before you can get through the rest of it. So I feel like sometimes, once leadership says yes, they expect results immediately. And so I think it's wonderful that they're getting more and more open to these resources, but that they are taking responsibility for the culture shift needed in some of our organizations. But I think that we also need to remind them that this isn't something that happens overnight, that it really is a process.
So that's a really good point, because what we're talking about here is where science meets art. It is both the art and science of fundraising. And what we're trying to say is there could be a whole lot more science. We could use a lot more math in doing our work. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about people, and we're still talking about relationships, and those work on their own time frame. And so educating people as to, these are the steps we're going to take, but those steps often are incremental, and it's not just a matter of identifying a person with a lot of money and going and asking them for their money. There are these other steps in between. So we didn't spend a lot of time on the relationship management process of qualifying and identifying good prospects, and then cultivating them, then going to a good solicitation, stewarding that relationship so that you can go back for even larger solicitation later, and the fact that you don't often just jump straight into a major gift with a donor. It often takes a few steps along the way. So you're absolutely right, Carrie. People need to be educated to that process and how that works.
Great. Thank you. So I think, in conclusion, we want to focus on what you can do next to begin to think about the data plan that's right and relevant for your organization. And so we've sort of made our own little checklist here, and I like that it's in sort of a step-by-step approach, because I feel like this is really something that this to me sort of represents a chronology, and something that each of these steps sort of builds on the other. So I think that that's a really appropriate visualization. And really, it just has to start with developing the plan, and that means understanding your goals for a project, whether that's annual goals and objectives, campaign goals and objectives, where are you at the moment, and what is it realistically that you want to try to accomplish. So setting out goals and objectives, understanding your resources, coming up with a timeline, and then evaluating what kind of data sources are available to help you with that data plan is really important. As we talked about, next you're going to have a conversation or a series of conversations to educate the stakeholders, to assure them, the relevance of these resources and of how you plan to implement them. And implementation is going to be really, really key. And again, when we talked about in the case study, that may be implementing not only a major gift program and a relationship-based major gift program, but it can also be helping you prioritize sort of that next tier of prospects, and thinking through how are you going to manage those prospects as a group and hope that they self-identify to help you begin to really bolster your pipeline. So there will likely be a curve here as you begin to educate stakeholders. But in our experience, and Jeff, feel free to jump in here, in our experience, once these stakeholders understand what we're trying to do and understand how it can really have an impact on a program, they get really excited. And then obviously within reason, based on the resources that are available, I think we've started to see a shift in their willingness to allocate this as a priority. So once you have the opportunity to discuss your plan with stakeholders, hopefully educate them and bring them on board, obviously you're going to have to assemble the available, the resources that are needed. And then focus really, this step should probably be 10 points bigger than all the other steps, because I think, implementation really is the critical piece of this that so often gets, I think, shortchanged. We spend so much time talking about what we're going to do, planning what we're going to do, thinking through how we're going to talk to people about what we're going to do, and then often when it comes time to just actually doing it, we lose something. So really be thoughtful in the beginning about what implementation is going to look like, how you're going to evaluate your success, what are your key, your timeline, your metrics going to be, so that when it comes time to implement, you know what you're really pointing toward, and you know how you're going to be able to prove to leadership that you've been successful. So developing those metrics, developing those dashboards, those reports that are going to allow you to share with your stakeholders that you've been successful is really, really important. And then obviously analyzing the results. So now that you've implemented, you can share with those stakeholders, where you are in the process. And even if you haven't completed the process, being able to demonstrate progress is really, really important. So analyzing results and sharing them with the appropriate audiences is both internal and external is really important. Establish and recommit to those metrics, and we're going to have sample metrics and a sample scorecard up on the website after this presentation. So if you want some suggestions, you can look there to think through, what, as Jeff mentioned earlier, what are the relevant metrics for what we're trying to accomplish. But in any case, once you've established them, make sure that you're reporting them on a regular basis. And then developing a scorecard, I think, is sort of the evolution of metrics, and we're seeing this more and more in our engagements, where you set a goal, you establish a metric so that so you can prove sort of how close to that goal you are, and you can track your progress to that goal. And then developing a scorecard is really where you take sort of an overarching objective and set of goals and think through how they sort of relate to the bigger picture, and loop in or fold in the relevant metrics that are going to help you get to those larger goals and objectives. So that's sort of the highest rung on this ladder or step on the staircase in terms of how you implement your data plan efficiently and effectively, and how you continue to share it with your stakeholders. Jeff, anything you want to add on implementation?
No, I think you've covered it. It's it is obviously the most important part. It's putting all this into play, and so following these steps as Carrie's laid out are really this is a very methodical way to get it done, and you just have to you really have to stick to it to get it done. So I'd say this is very helpful.
Great. Any other questions, Sarah?
Yeah, actually we did receive a question from the audience. How do you deal with the black box aspects of off-the-shelf modeling services where in-house staff cannot manually validate, compared with screenings or attachment/affinity scores where staff researchers can validate?
So I think this goes back to earlier when I was talking about the transparency of RFM scores and how, as Jeff mentioned, these come from the world of marketing, and for many of our board members who are familiar with marketing or in the business world, the idea of being able to be transparent about how these scores were derived is really comforting. Mm-hmm. I think, we talk a little bit about the black box, and when you get into predictive modeling, whether you're talking about logistic regression or clustering, or there are lots of different methodologies that are being used, but none of them are as simple as saying, you got this amount because you gave often, you got this amount because you gave a lot, you gave this amount because you gave recently. And so I think on some level, you can explain the general methodology that's being used to drive those predictive models. If you want to, if you have people that are really, really interested and they want to know sort of the basics of logistic regression, you can have your staff or your vendor walk them through that. And then often there are essentially formulas, there are equations that come out of these predictive models that essentially demonstrate the weighting of the different variables and show how important different variables were to the model. And I think those are translatable to an audience. I think conceptually you can say, it turns out that where somebody lived or what year they graduated or that they like to wear yellow raincoats is really, really important in describing this particular characteristic. So I think that our audiences can understand that, even if they don't understand or don't need to understand the underlying information that is inside that black box. But it's going to mean establishing trust in your in-house staff or rapport with your vendor to be able to relay that confidently.
Okay, great, Carrie. We did have a question about, are there any helpful scorecard models that you've come across? But I know that we'll have them online after the webinar.
Yeah, and I should just say that there are a lot of different versions of scorecards, and there are more and more of them that are creeping their way into the nonprofit universe. And I'm not certain, I don't know if Jeff, if you have an opinion, I'm not certain that there's any one best solution. We're going to have a sample, but I think for me the idea of the scorecard, again, is to get you to think bigger picture and to think about what a program or what an organization is looking to accomplish across a variety of areas, and to think through how, what are the metrics that are going to allow you to track progress and how all of those things relate up to the big picture.
Yeah, I would just say that you be sure to identify the things and help your board and your management, whoever's going to be looking at it, be sure to identify the things that are most important to track, and the things that are going to show trends, so you can track trends, because from a management perspective, they want to use it to know how are we doing, and they want to see progress. You can use it for a campaign committee, for example, for a committee of volunteers or a development committee, so that from one meeting to the next, they get a sense of where things are and where they're going, and it's especially helpful when you can do those against goal. They want to know, how are we doing? Are we halfway towards our goal? So visual scorecards are really helpful, where they can just see pie charts or bar graphs, or something that gives them a quick visual understanding of where you are and how you're doing. So I think there are a lot of different models that you could use, but keep in mind what you're trying to achieve with it before you put it together.
All right. Well, thank you, Carrie and Jeff. I think we've hit our hour mark. Really enjoyed having this presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. And I want to let you know that we have an upcoming webinar on March 13th, 12 p.m. Central Time, called Case Development 201, and this will be led by Andy Brommel, who's the Director of Communications Consulting here at Campbell & Company. We'll build on last year's Case Development 101 and address some common challenges that organizations face in developing and refining their philanthropic messages. You can register online at campbellcompany.com. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email us at webinars@campbellcompany.com, or you can give us a call at 312-896-8881. And from all of us at Campbell & Company, thank you so much, and we hope you have a great 2013. Thanks.